My sister Zara told me something before she died that I'll never forget. When you can't stand, you crawl. When you can't crawl, you find another way. I thought it was just military talk until I watched her drag herself across 200 meters of desert with both legs mangled, clutching a radio that would save 40 lives. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Most people think they know what courage looks like. They picture soldiers charging into battle or firefighters running into burning buildings. But real courage? It's quieter than that. It's bloodier. It's my 28-year-old sister using her fingernails to claw through sand and rock, because giving up wasn't an option when 40 soldiers were driving straight into a kill zone. Zara Caldwell wasn't supposed to be a hero. She was supposed to come home for Thanksgiving that year, surprise our parents, and finally tell Dad that maybe joining the Army hadn't been the mistake he thought it was. She was an Army combat engineer from small-town Texas, who spent her days detecting roadside bombs so that supply convoys could deliver food and medicine to villages that needed both desperately. She called it building hope in hopeless places, which sounds cheesy until you understand that every road she cleared meant kids could walk to school without stepping on explosives. The thing about Zara is that she never did anything the easy way. When she broke her ankle playing soccer at 12, she refused crutches because walking normally is for quitters. When Dad tried to talk her out of enlisting after college, she looked him dead in the eye and said, "I'm not built for sitting behind a desk while other people do the dangerous work." She had this stubborn streak that drove our family crazy and kept her alive longer than it should have. But October 15, 2019, in the middle of the Afghan desert, that stubborn streak became something else entirely. It became the difference between 40 families getting their sons and daughters home alive and 40 flag-draped coffins returning to American soil. Because when an improvised explosive device shattered both of Zara's legs and left her bleeding in the sand with enemy fighters moving into position for an ambush, she had exactly one choice: crawl or let them die. What happened next isn't a story about superhuman strength or military training. It's about what happens when someone decides that other people's lives matter more than their own pain. It's about the 200 meters that separated my sister from a radio that could call in an airstrike to save those soldiers. 200 meters that might as well have been 200 miles when you're dragging yourself forward with your arms alone, leaving a trail of blood in the desert sand. I know this story because Zara lived long enough to tell it to me. She lived long enough to receive the Silver Star and to work with veterans who needed to learn that broken doesn't mean finished. But she also lived long enough to make sure I understood that what she did that day wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human in the moment when humanity costs everything you have. Before I tell you how she crawled those 200 meters, you need to understand who Zara was before that explosion. You need to know about the woman who chose to join the military because she wanted to rebuild things instead of destroy them, who wrote letters to Afghan children learning English, and who called home every single Sunday to tell Mom about the roads her team had cleared that week. Because the person she was before that moment is what made the crawl possible. This is the story of how my sister saved 40 lives by refusing to die quietly, and it starts 3 weeks before she was supposed to come home for good. Forward Operating Base Thunder, Afghanistan, October 2019, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, and Zara had already started planning the surprise. She'd bought a plane ticket under Mom's maiden name, coordinated with our cousin Derek to pick her up from Dallas, and even practiced the speech she was going to give Dad about how military service had taught her things no college classroom ever could. She was finally ready to prove that enlisting hadn't been rebellion against his dreams for her future, but the fulfillment of values he'd taught her since childhood. The base itself looked like every other FOB in Afghanistan, a collection of concrete barriers, prefab buildings, and dust that got into everything no matter how tightly you sealed your gear. But to Zara, it had become something like home. She knew which shower stalls had the best water pressure, which mess hall cook made the least terrible coffee, and exactly how many steps it took to walk from her bunk to the motor pool where her team gathered every morning at 500 hours. Her unit, the 52nd Engineer Company, specialized in route clearance operations. While other soldiers engaged enemy combatants directly, Zara and her team fought a different kind of war against improvised explosive devices that could turn any road into a death trap. They were the soldiers who went first, sweeping highways and supply routes with metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and an intuitive understanding of how insurgents thought when they planted bombs designed to kill Americans and the Afghans who worked with them. Sergeant First Class Maria Torres had been Zara's squad leader for both deployments, and the closest thing she had to a mentor in the Army. Torres was a 12-year veteran from El Paso who joined the engineers because, as she put it, "I'd rather build roads than blow them up." She taught Zara that their job wasn't just about finding explosives. It was about understanding the human cost of every convoy that moves safely through their sector. "Every road we clear means families get food, medicine gets through, kids get to school safely," Torres told her during their first week in country. "We're not just removing bombs, Caldwell. We're removing barriers between people and the things they need to survive." That philosophy shaped everything about how Zara approached her work. She kept photos in her helmet of children from the villages their convoy supplied. Kids whose faces lit up when trucks arrived with school supplies, medical equipment, and sometimes just basic necessities like flour and cooking oil. When other soldiers asked why she'd volunteered for route clearance when she could have chosen a safer military occupation, she showed them those photos. The morning routine at FOB Thunder started the same way every day. Zara would wake at 04:30, check her gear, and write a few lines in the journal she planned to give Mom for Christmas. Then she'd grab coffee that tasted like motor oil and join her team for the daily intelligence briefing. These briefings covered everything from weather conditions to recent insurgent activity, but they always ended the same way, with a reminder that real people were counting on them to do their jobs correctly. Her team consisted of 6 soldiers, each with specialized skills that kept them alive in a job where mistakes meant death. There was Specialist Rodriguez, barely 19, who could spot disturbed earth from 50 meters away. Staff Sergeant Kim, a former college chemistry major who understood explosives better than the people who built them. Private Johnson, whose steady hands could disarm devices that would make bomb disposal experts nervous. And Corporal Williams, the team's communications specialist who maintained contact with headquarters and coordinated with convoy commanders. They'd been working together for 8 months, long enough to develop the kind of unspoken communication that kept combat units alive. Zara could tell from Rodriguez's posture when he'd spotted something suspicious. Kim's breathing changed when she was examining a device that made her nervous. Johnson's jokes got darker when the mission felt more dangerous than usual. Williams talked faster when he was relaying information that couldn't wait. But October 15th felt different from the moment they gathered for morning briefing. Intelligence reports indicated unusual insurgent movement in their sector over the previous 72 hours. Local informants had gone silent, which usually meant something significant was being planned. Most concerning, intercepted communication suggested a coordinated attack was imminent, though analysts couldn't determine the specific target or timing. The mission assignment came down from division headquarters with unusual urgency. Route Phoenix, the main supply line connecting FOB Thunder to 3 remote villages, showed signs of fresh IED placement. A 40-vehicle convoy carrying critical supplies was scheduled to transit the route in 6 hours. Food, medicine, winter clothing for families in villages that would be cut off by snow within weeks. The kind of supplies that meant the difference between surviving the coming winter and not. Zara's team had one chance to clear the route before the convoy departed. Intelligence suggested they were dealing with a sophisticated network of devices, possibly connected to allow for coordinated detonation. The kind of setup that could destroy multiple vehicles simultaneously and turn a humanitarian mission into a massacre. As they prepared their equipment that morning, Torres pulled Zara aside. "I've got a bad feeling about this one, Caldwell. Promise me you'll trust your instincts out there. If something feels wrong, speak up immediately." Zara nodded, checking her gear one final time. Detection equipment, communications devices, protective materials, medical supplies. Everything she needed to do a job that had become as natural as breathing over 2 deployments. She had no way of knowing that in less than 4 hours, most of that equipment would be destroyed in an explosion that would test everything she'd learned about courage, determination, and the lengths someone will go to protect strangers they've never met. The last thing she did before boarding the vehicle that would take her team to Route Phoenix was check her phone for messages from home. A text from Mom asking about the weather, a photo from Dad of their dog wearing a Halloween costume. Normal family communication that felt like a lifeline to the world she was fighting to protect and the home she'd see again in 3 weeks. She had no idea she'd never make it to Thanksgiving dinner. The first mile of Route Phoenix looked normal. Packed dirt worn smooth by years of vehicle traffic, scattered rocks that had been there so long they'd become landmarks, the kind of terrain Zara's team had cleared hundreds of times before. Rodriguez swept his metal detector in steady arcs while Kim analyzed soil patterns for signs of recent digging. The rhythm was familiar, almost meditative, until Specialist Rodriguez stopped moving and raised his closed fist. "Contact," he called softly, the single word that meant everything was about to change. Zara moved forward to examine what Rodriguez had found. Buried 18 inches beneath the surface, her detection equipment revealed the outline of an IED larger than anything they'd encountered in this sector. The device measured roughly 3 feet across, packed with enough explosive material to destroy an entire convoy. But as Kim knelt beside her to analyze the construction, something didn't feel right. "This is too obvious," Kim whispered, running her fingers along the disturbed earth. "Look at the soil displacement pattern. Someone wanted us to find this." That's when Zara noticed the wire, a thin strand of copper barely visible against the brown earth, running perpendicular to the road toward a cluster of rocks 30 meters away. Her blood went cold as she realized what she was looking at. The massive IED wasn't the primary threat. It was bait designed to draw them into position for something worse. "Torres, we've got a secondary device," Zara radioed to her squad leader, who was positioned 50 meters back with the rest of the team. "The main IED is connected to something in those rocks. This whole setup is designed to funnel us into a kill zone." Torres's voice crackled back immediately. "Can you trace the wire without triggering anything?" Zara studied the terrain, calculating angles and distances. The secondary device was positioned perfectly to catch anyone investigating the primary IED. Whoever had planned this understood how American route clearance teams operated. They knew Zara's team would send their most experienced soldier forward to examine any suspicious device. They were counting on military protocol to deliver their target directly into range. "I need to get closer to determine the trigger mechanism," Zara told Torres. "But if I'm wrong about the activation sequence, this thing could take out half the team." "Negative, Caldwell. Fall back and we'll call in EOD support." But even as Torres gave the order, Zara was checking her watch. The convoy carrying supplies to those 3 villages was scheduled to depart in 4 hours and 30 minutes. Calling in explosive ordnance disposal specialists would delay the mission by at least 6 hours, assuming they were available immediately. Those families waiting for winter supplies couldn't afford that kind of delay. More importantly, something about the entire setup suggested this wasn't just about stopping one convoy. The sophistication of the device network, the strategic positioning along the main supply route, the timing that coincided with increased insurgent activity, it all pointed to something bigger than a single attack. Zara made the decision that would save her life and doom her legs. Instead of falling back as ordered, she began tracing the wire toward the secondary device, moving with the careful precision that had kept her alive through 2 deployments. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. She was 20 meters from the rocks when her detection equipment started screaming warnings. The secondary device wasn't where she expected it to be. It was directly beneath her feet. "Contact! Contact!" she shouted into her radio as she realized the terrible truth. There wasn't just a secondary device. There was an entire network of connected explosives, and she was standing in the middle of it. The insurgents hadn't just planned to kill American soldiers. They'd designed a system to eliminate the route clearance team first, ensuring the convoy would drive straight into the primary IED without warning. Torres was already moving, shouting orders to the rest of the team when the first explosion erupted beneath Zara's position. The blast launched her 15 feet through the air, the concussion wave hitting her like a physical wall. But that was just the beginning. The network of secondary devices began detonating in sequence, each explosion designed to catch anyone attempting rescue operations. When the dust settled and the ringing in her ears subsided enough to think clearly, Zara realized she was completely alone. The sequential explosions had forced her team to fall back beyond the blast radius, following standard protocol for multiple device scenarios. She could hear Torres shouting her name through the smoke, but the distance between them might as well have been measured in miles rather than meters. The pain in her legs was unlike anything she'd experienced. Looking down, she could see compound fractures in both tibias, blood soaking through her uniform pants, and her right foot twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. But the physical damage wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding exactly what the insurgents had accomplished. Her team's radio equipment had been destroyed in the blast. The backup communication systems were with Torres, now pinned down by the possibility of additional devices between his position and hers. Standard operating procedures dictated that no one would attempt a rescue until EOD specialists could clear a safe path, which could take hours. Meanwhile, the convoy was still scheduled to depart in less than 4 hours. Without her team's clearance certification, those 40 vehicles would either be delayed indefinitely or forced to take alternative routes that were even more dangerous. The families in those villages would go without critical supplies as winter approached. Worse, if this was part of a coordinated attack, delaying the convoy might simply give insurgents more time to position additional forces. But Zara still had one piece of equipment that had survived the explosion. Her personal emergency radio, designed for situations exactly like this. The radio that could reach FOB Thunder and call in the airstrike necessary to eliminate the remaining threat. The radio that was currently strapped to her back, 200 meters from the communication point where it could actually transmit a signal strong enough to reach base. 200 meters of open desert terrain, with both legs shattered and enemy fighters potentially moving into position for the coordinated attack her team had been warned about. 200 meters that would determine whether 40 American soldiers drove into an ambush or made it safely to deliver supplies that 3 villages desperately needed. Zara closed her eyes and tried to remember everything Torres had taught her about courage. Lying in the sand with shattered legs and the taste of blood in her mouth, Zara stared at the communication point 200 meters away. It might as well have been on the moon. Every breath sent waves of agony through her chest where shrapnel had torn through her body armor. Her vision kept blurring from blood loss and she could feel her strength ebbing with each heartbeat. But then she heard Torres's voice cutting through the ringing in her ears, shouting from somewhere beyond the blast zone. "Caldwell, stay put. We're going to get you out of there. Stay put." The words that would normally mean safety and rescue. The words that would guarantee her survival while 40 soldiers drove straight into the kill zone she'd discovered. Zara closed her eyes and tried to calculate how long it would take for EOD specialists to clear a safe path to her position. 2 hours minimum, maybe 4. The convoy would be long gone by then, carrying winter supplies those villages needed and driving straight into an ambush that would turn humanitarian aid into a massacre. She thought about the photos tucked inside her helmet. Amara, the 8-year-old girl from Kamdesh village who'd drawn pictures of flowers for the American soldiers. Hassan, the 12-year-old boy who practiced English phrases so he could thank the convoy drivers personally. Fatima, whose grandmother needed the insulin that was packed somewhere in those 40 vehicles scheduled to depart in 3 hours and 47 minutes. Torres had taught her something during their first deployment that she'd never forgotten. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Caldwell. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And sometimes what needs to be done is going to hurt more than you think you can survive. Zara reached behind her back, fingers trembling from shock and blood loss, until she found the emergency radio still strapped to her pack. The device was designed for exactly this situation, when everything else failed and a soldier needed to make contact with base for emergency extraction or fire support. But it only worked from designated communication points where the signal could bounce off relay towers positioned throughout the sector. The nearest communication point was marked by a small metal stake driven into the ground exactly 200 meters from her current position. She could see it glinting in the afternoon sun. A tiny beacon that represented the difference between living quietly while others died and doing something that might save them all. She looked down at her legs again. Both tibias were clearly broken, with bone fragments visible through torn fabric. Her right ankle was twisted completely around, and blood was pooling in the sand beneath her. Moving was going to be agony. Moving might kill her, but staying meant accepting that her discovery of the IED network would die with her, while 40 soldiers drove into the trap she'd identified. The decision, when it came, felt surprisingly calm. Zara took the photo of the village children from her helmet and propped it against a rock where she could see their faces. Then she began the process of preparing herself for the most important crawl of her life. First, she needed to stop the bleeding as much as possible. Using her combat knife, she cut strips from her uniform jacket and tied improvised tourniquets above the worst fractures. The pain was so intense it made her vision go white, but she forced herself to work methodically, the way Torres had taught her to approach any dangerous situation. Next, she created a drag system using her equipment pack and the straps from her gear harness. By distributing her weight across the pack's frame, she could pull herself forward using her arms while minimizing further damage to her legs. It wasn't elegant, but it might keep her moving long enough to reach the communication point. The hardest part was psychological preparation. 200 meters of desert terrain dotted with rocks, debris from the explosion, and patches of sand that would make dragging herself forward even more difficult. In her current condition, every meter was going to feel like a mile. Every inch was going to cost blood, strength, and pieces of determination she wasn't sure she possessed. But as she adjusted the radio's frequency to match Fob Thunder's emergency channel, Zara remembered something else Torres had said. The moment you start thinking about the whole distance is the moment you quit. Think about reaching that rock, then think about reaching the next one. Break it into pieces small enough that your mind can handle them. She looked at the terrain ahead and began mapping her route. First goal, a piece of debris from the explosion about 20 meters away. Second goal, a natural depression in the ground that would provide some concealment if enemy fighters were moving into position. Third goal, a cluster of rocks that marked the halfway point. Each segment was manageable. Each segment was survivable. The children's faces in the photo seemed to be watching her as she positioned herself for the crawl. Amara's smile. Hassan's determined expression as he practiced English words. Fatima's eyes full of hope that American soldiers would bring the medicine her grandmother needed. I'm not doing this to be a hero, Zara whispered to their faces. I'm doing this because you matter, because those 40 soldiers have families who love them, because giving up isn't an option when other people's lives depend on me refusing to quit. She took one last look back toward where Torres and the rest of her team were positioned, knowing they couldn't see her through the smoke and debris. Then she gripped the drag harness, said a quick prayer to whatever force watches over stubborn soldiers who refuse to die quietly, and began pulling herself toward the first piece of debris. The pain that shot through her body with the first movement was so intense she nearly lost consciousness, but she held on to the photo of those children and kept moving. 1 inch at a time, 1 breath at a time, one small victory over the voice in her head that screamed for her to stop. 20 meters had never seemed so far away. The first 50 meters nearly broke her. Every pull forward sent lightning bolts of agony through her shattered legs, and the blood trail she was leaving in the sand looked like something from a crime scene. But Zara had found a rhythm that worked. Grip the harness, pull with both arms, breathe through the pain, rest for 30 seconds, then repeat. The piece of debris she'd targeted as her first goal took 23 minutes to reach. By the 100-meter mark, she was hallucinating. Torres appeared beside her, walking casually through the desert as if they were on a training exercise back at Fort Leonard Wood. You're doing good, Caldwell, his voice said clearly. Remember what I taught you about pain? It's just information. Your body telling you it's damaged. But damage doesn't mean finished. The hallucination felt so real she tried to respond but only managed a weak grunt. Her arms were shaking uncontrollably now, and she'd lost feeling in her left leg completely. The emergency radio on her back felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and twice she'd considered abandoning it to move faster. But without the radio, the crawl was meaningless. At 150 meters, with 50 meters still to go, Zara's body began shutting down. Her vision tunneled to a small circle directly in front of her face. Her heart was racing, but she could barely feel her pulse. Blood loss was winning the race against determination, and she knew she had maybe one more push left before unconsciousness claimed her. That's when she saw them. Movement in her peripheral vision made her turn her head, and through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, she spotted figures moving into position along Route Phoenix. Not her team, not American soldiers, enemy fighters, at least a dozen of them, carrying RPGs and automatic weapons, positioning themselves in concealment points that would give them perfect fields of fire when the convoy arrived. The IED network she'd discovered wasn't the whole plan. It was just the opening move. The explosives were designed to stop the convoy and force the vehicles into a kill zone where insurgent fighters could destroy them systematically. 40 soldiers trapped in burning vehicles while enemy combatants picked them off from concealment. The villages would lose their winter supplies, and 40 American families would lose their sons and daughters. Unless she could reach that radio and call in an airstrike to eliminate the threat. The knowledge that this was bigger than she'd imagined gave Zara strength she didn't know she still possessed. She grabbed the drag harness and pulled herself forward with everything she had left. 30 meters. 25. 20. Each meter cost her blood and pieces of consciousness, but she could see the metal stake that marked the communication point growing larger ahead of her. With 10 meters left, her arms gave out completely. She couldn't grip the harness anymore, couldn't pull herself forward another inch. Her body had reached the absolute limit of human endurance. But 10 meters might as well have been 10 miles when you couldn't move your arms. So Zara did something that still makes me proud of her stubborn refusal to quit. She rolled onto her back, positioned the radio where she could reach it, and began pushing herself backward toward the communication point, using her elbows and shoulders, inch by inch, breath by breath, leaving a wider blood trail but still moving toward the only thing that could save those soldiers. 5 meters from the communication point, she heard vehicle engines in the distance. The convoy was departing early, probably due to changing weather conditions or revised intelligence reports. Instead of 3 hours, she had maybe 45 minutes before 40 vehicles loaded with winter supplies and American soldiers drove straight into the ambush she'd just discovered. With 2 meters left, Zara's vision started going black around the edges. Blood loss was winning. Her body was shutting down organ by organ, system by system, but she could see the metal stake that marked the communication point, could see where she needed to position the radio antenna to bounce a signal off the relay towers. 1 meter, 6 inches, 3 inches. She reached the communication point with 17 minutes to spare before the convoy entered the kill zone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely operate the radio controls, but muscle memory from countless training exercises guided her through the startup sequence. The radio crackled to life and she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the voice of the communications specialist at FOB Thunder. "Thunder Base, this is Caldwell with emergency traffic," she whispered into the microphone, her voice barely audible but steady. "I have eyes on multiple enemy fighters positioned for ambush along Route Phoenix. Grid coordinates follow." She relayed everything, the exact positions of the insurgent fighters, the IED network that was designed to trap the convoy, the systematic nature of the ambush that would have destroyed every vehicle and killed every soldier. Her voice got weaker with each transmission, but she forced herself to provide every detail that would help the Airstrike pilots eliminate the threat. "Caldwell, confirm your position for immediate extraction," came the response from base. "Negative on extraction," Zara replied, looking at the blood pooled around her body. "I'm not going anywhere, but those fighters need to be eliminated before the convoy reaches checkpoint Bravo. You have maybe 10 minutes. The airstrike came 8 minutes later. She heard the jets before she saw them, then watched as precision munitions eliminated every enemy position she'd identified. Secondary explosions from the IED network lit up the desert like deadly fireworks. Within minutes, Route Phoenix was clear and safe for the convoy carrying winter supplies to families who desperately needed them. 40 soldiers would make it home to their families. 3 villages would survive the winter, all because Zara had refused to die quietly, when other people's lives depended on her crawling 200 meters through hell itself. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of Torres's voice on her radio, following her blood trail across the desert to bring her home. Zara spent the next 47 hours in surgery at Bagram Air Base, where military doctors fought to save her legs with the same determination she'd shown crawling across that desert. They managed to reconstruct her left leg using titanium rods and bone grafts, but her right leg was too damaged to save. When she woke up 3 days later with one leg amputated below the knee, and the other held together with enough metal to set off airport security for life, her first words weren't about the pain or her injuries. "Did the supplies make it through?" she asked the nurse, checking her vitals. The convoy had completed its mission perfectly. 40 vehicles delivered winter clothing, medical supplies, and food to 3 villages that would have faced starvation without that aid. More importantly, 40 soldiers returned home alive to their families because Zara had crawled 200 meters to call in coordinates for an airstrike that eliminated an entire insurgent cell. But Zara's recovery became its own kind of battle. 8 months of surgeries, physical therapy, and learning to walk with a prosthetic leg that felt foreign and clumsy after 28 years of taking mobility for granted. The doctors told her she'd never run again, never deploy again, probably never feel completely comfortable with physical activity again. They were wrong about everything except the deployment part. What they didn't understand about my sister was that losing her leg hadn't changed her fundamental nature. She approached prosthetic training with the same stubborn intensity she'd brought to route clearance operations. When the physical therapist said most amputees needed 6 months to walk confidently with a prosthetic, Zara was jogging within 12 weeks. When they told her military careers typically ended with injuries like hers, she reminded them that her brain and her training were intact. Thank you very much. The Army disagreed, medically retiring her with full honors and a Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation reads like something from a movie. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, while serving as a combat engineer with the 52nd Engineer Company during Operation Freedom Sentinel. Specialist Caldwell's exceptional bravery, decisive actions, and selfless dedication to duty resulted in the preservation of American lives and successful completion of a critical humanitarian mission. But the medal ceremony felt weird to her. Standing there in dress uniform while generals talked about heroism and sacrifice, Zara kept thinking about Hassan, the 12-year-old boy from Kamdesh village who'd been practicing English phrases. She wondered if he'd received the school supplies that were in that convoy. She wondered if Fatima's grandmother had gotten the insulin she needed. The medal was nice, but what mattered was whether those families had survived the winter. The letters started arriving 6 months after she returned home. Dozens of them, forwarded through military channels from villages throughout Afghanistan. Parents thanking her for ensuring their children received winter clothing. Teachers describing schools that stayed open because educational supplies had arrived on schedule. Village elders explaining how medical equipment had saved lives during the harsh mountain winter. One letter, written in careful English by a boy named Hassan, said simply, "Thank you for keeping the road open so the trucks could bring us hope." That letter is framed on Zara's desk now, in the office where she works with veteran organizations, teaching resilience training to soldiers transitioning back to civilian life. She tells them what Torres taught her about courage, what she learned about breaking impossible tasks into manageable pieces, and what crawling 200 meters through the desert taught her about the difference between giving up and giving in. Strength isn't measured by what we can carry when we're whole, she tells groups of wounded veterans struggling with their own recovery battles. It's measured by what we're willing to drag ourselves through when we're broken. I didn't crawl across that desert to be a hero. I crawled because 40 lives depended on someone refusing to quit. And I happened to be the someone who was there. The kids from her neighborhood call her the lady with the robot leg and think she's the coolest adult they know. She teaches them that different doesn't mean less capable, that adapting to challenges makes you stronger rather than weaker. When they ask if it hurts, she's honest. Sometimes, but the pain reminds me that I'm still here, still able to help people, still able to make a difference. 3 years after the explosion, Zara married a fellow veteran who'd lost his arm in Iraq. Their wedding photos show two people who understand that love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing someone whose scars complement your own. They run a nonprofit now that provides adaptive sports equipment to disabled veterans, proving that losing pieces of yourself doesn't mean losing your ability to live fully. But I think the real lesson from Zara's story isn't about military heroism or physical courage. It's about what happens when someone decides that other people's lives matter more than their own comfort. Every day, in small ways and large ones, we all face moments when we can choose between doing what's easy and doing what's necessary. The difference between those choices is what separates people who complain about problems from people who solve them. Zara taught me that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about what you do when you're already on the ground, bleeding into the sand with 200 meters between you and the thing that needs to be done. It's about finding reasons to keep moving when your body is screaming at you to stop. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought 1 inch at a time by people nobody will ever call heroes. Every time I face something that seems impossible, I remember my sister in that Afghan desert, broken but not beaten, crawling toward a radio that could save lives she'd never personally know. That image reminds me that courage isn't the absence of fear or pain. Courage is deciding that someone else's survival matters more than your own suffering, and that's a choice any of us can make. Any day in any situation where someone needs us to be stronger than we think we are.